Big Blue Book Club presents Snack Club with Courtney Luecking and Anna Cason, featuring raising a happy, healthy eater and how to raise a mindful eater. Now, here are our hosts.
Feeding children is an adventure, and at some point or another, you might have had questions like, am I doing this right? Or is this normal?
Headlines, things we see online, things we hear from family and friends, and even unpacking what we see in the store can have us questioning what to feed our children. We want children to have what they need to lead happy, healthy lives, and it seems like as soon as we figure something out, it changes.
That's where we come in. My name is Dr. Courtney Luecking. I'm a registered dietitian and extension specialist for family and child nutrition. This means I have lots of training and expertise about child nutrition. I also have two littles of my own. This combination allows me to talk through practical, science-based strategies for creating a nourishing feeding environment for your family.
And my name is Anna Cason. I'm a registered dietitian and extension associate in food and nutrition. I don't have kids of my own, but my interests and passion lie in supporting healthy food-related behaviors, which begin in childhood.
In partnership with the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Services, we present Snack Club, where we share bite-sized bits of information for supporting nourished, active children in Kentucky.
So come for the snacks and stay for the support.
Again, here we are. I am really excited about this episode.
I am too. It's probably one of my favorite topics to talk to someone about.
Yes, I had first learned about this concept of the 5 W's, or maybe that's what I've called it, but this idea of roles and responsibilities during mealtime. I first learned about it in my first job as a dietitian. I was working with the Women, Infants, and Children program, went to a training, and I was like, wow, this makes it so much easier for me to talk about feeding with families. And now that I have children of my own, it's becoming personally interesting and a helpful reminder. So I'm so pleased that we can share it with folks today.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear about your experiences with your kids and then to share about my general experience just with the education of it all.
Yes. So what we're talking about today, mealtimes can feel like a chore or a struggle wherever you are in the parenting journey. And part of that might be the tension between us wanting to provide, us the adults, I should say, wanting to provide nutritious foods and then wanting children to eat those foods. And there might be a difference between what they actually want to eat or what they're asking for. And so that can be this power struggle. And so we're going to talk about this idea of the division of responsibility. So Anna, why don't you tell us, what does that even look like?
So essentially it's talking about the division of responsibility within meal times or snack times around food altogether. So caregivers, parents, they are responsible for providing the what. So putting the food on the table or in front of the little one, and then also deciding where and when meal or snack times will happen. So really setting that structure. And then once that is provided to the child is then responsible for choosing what to eat out of what is put in front of them and how much of that to eat.
So let's put this as an example. So that's kind of like how we got to the W's, right? Who or what, when, where, and kind of this idea of whether. I guess there's only 4, but I know there's a thing somewhere. But so like let's give an example where we're sitting at a table and there's a lot of food left on a kid's plate, and a parent, with good intentions just says you haven't had enough to eat yet.
Or you haven't finished your insert whatever nutritious food they're providing.
Yes. And so that could be a little bit of pushback then that we get from kids. And so that's an example of where a parent or just a caregiver is stepping over that boundary of roles and responsibilities.
They're providing an external cue to the child rather than allowing the child to decide for themselves how much and what they want to eat.
Yes, and so it's true. Adults have a lot more experience and we know a lot more than children. And at the same token, we're not in their bodies. And so I think that's what's been helpful for me. We as adults, we know more about what kinds of foods are nourishing for children's bodies. So we can make those decisions for what. And then we kind of have a better understanding of growth and development, that foods might be needed more often throughout certain periods of life when they're young, or growth spurts or things of that nature. And then our role to help set up for success when we're determining where that's all happening. So that's how we can share our wisdom. But when we're trying to lean into this trust, I think that's where it becomes a tension, right? It's like we want to control, but at the end of the day, we have to trust ourselves that we can do those three things, and then trust that children can do their job
make the decision for themselves.
Yeah. So why don't we talk a little bit more about hunger and satiety or fullness? Because I think when we're looking at a plate, we think, oh yeah, you had enough. This happened to me last night. I was she's 19 months, and she just wanted more applesauce. And so I kept giving her more, and I was struck. I'm like, I just want dinner time to be over to move on to bath and bedtime. But then I was like, oh, maybe she really does want more, you know, so it was like having to have that moment. Yes. Like, I want to move on with my day, but she wasn't quite ready. So maybe let's tune into that hunger and fullness factor.
Yeah. So that really plays into the child's role of deciding how much. So they can tune into their bodies and listen to what it's saying to decide if they have eaten and if they feel satisfied with what they've eaten, or if they are still hungry for more. And it's the caregiver's role to kind of help them tune into it. So instead of saying, are you done? You can phrase it as a question so that they can check in with their body. Are you full, or are you still hungry? So really letting them tune in, and then provide the answer. And then from there, just moving on with it.
So I like that it's such a small difference in what you just said. Are you done? And then transitioning that to saying, are you full, or are you still hungry? Kind of providing those options. And so in the previous work life, I guess I worked with adults, and a lot of times they were like, I don't know what hunger feels like, or they were describing these really extreme, like, oh, that's hungry. And they're like, I had no idea. So I know that you have had some great experience with kind of the body cues and things. So why don't we talk more about how do we as adults know if we're hungry, and then how we could share that with kids to help them tune into that?
Yeah. So really, for adults to be able to recognize it, it does start at a young age. So kind of what we have talked about in previous episodes, if we're encouraged to completely clean our plate or finish a certain amount of something, then that's really overstepping that option or opportunity to check in and see if we have had enough. So kind of figuring it out as adults, then we can teach children at a young age to kind of do this, and then they can carry it on to adulthood. So some of these signs or symptoms that we often, probably all of us, recognize is like being hangry, or once you kind of hit that point where you're like, I need food now, my mood has changed because I'm hungry, like my body is telling me I need food.
Oh my gosh, quick aside, but I think those listening could probably relate. Like, I can literally see a switch flip in my kids. And it's like, oh, we've actually named their alter egos. And so my older one's now able to say like, oh, so-and-so's here because she's like hungry. But yes, the switch flips.
So I feel like
extreme.
That's the extreme side of hunger. And there are some maybe more subtle cues or signs that kind of lead up to that we can, once we know about them, we can start to recognize them both in ourselves and then also in our children. So one of them for within ourselves, like if we start to think about food or fantasizing about our next meal, like if you're at work and you realize that you're kind of like daydreaming about what you packed for lunch or something, that's kind of a signal like, oh, maybe my body's starting to hint that hunger is starting to creep up. So it's not something that's driving your mood or anything, but it is just kind of in the back of your mind. And it's like, oh, okay, maybe a little hungry now.
And so for kids, I'm thinking that might look like when they come to you and they're like, I want this, or I want that, or they just say, I'm hungry. That might be kind of that early sign. And we'll talk about how to navigate that. But yes, okay. So we're thinking about it, and maybe as kids, we verbalize it.
And then some of the more, so that's kind of more of like a mental in our head, we're thinking about it, but then also some physical signs. So like brain fog, or if you feel like you're having a hard time making decisions, or you're starting to feel fatigued, like oftentimes we yawn and we say, oh, I just need more coffee, or I just didn't sleep well last
You're
night.
speaking to me.
So a lot of times those are our body's ways of telling us like, hey, I need true energy. Like I need that fuel in the source of food. So those are some of the more subtle physical ways of our bodies telling us that we're hungry, which again, eventually if we don't feed it, then that's when we have the adult temper tantrum and we get hangry and we're like, oh, I need whatever food is in sight.
Okay, so for kiddos, then they may not quite be able to verbalize, like my brain's foggy, but
Yeah.
again, maybe if you just start to see their energy, kind of those
Yeah.
natural lulls in the day, we could think about those might be opportune times to
Yeah.
plan snacks, for example.
Yeah.
So wanting to kind of, it is important for children to feel hunger and feel
Yeah.
satisfaction. So we're not trying to say like, make sure your kids are fed at all times,
Yeah.
because part of that is just the natural rhythm and
Yeah.
cycles of our bodies functioning. But also planning ahead and structuring the day so that it doesn't get so extreme where they're so
Yeah.
hungry and then so full.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, so having that plan and having snacks on hand, whether it's like a granola bar or nuts, something that's easy to pack, or if you're at home, having some produce that's available in the fridge so you can quickly grab it and serve it with a dip or something like that.
So I think this kind of tying it back to these W's of like the trusting, we're trusting that kids know when they've had enough, but they need to be able to trust us that we are providing those nourishing foods that can sustain that energy, can sustain that satisfaction between meals and snacks. So it is this careful dance, if you will.
Like tug and pull.
I don't want to say tug of war. That sounds really intense.
So it's like a back and forth.
Yes, a give and take.
Yes.
Okay, great. Let's see. So we've talked about the W's. One thing I want to circle back to, and in a previous episode, we talked about what to feed children. And it's also from Ellen Satter, who's this registered dietitian. She's a licensed therapist. She's done a lot in terms of the child feeding. So she created this idea or framework for the division of responsibility. She also created this hierarchy of food, which is similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like we need fundamental needs met. And so when we talk about all of these ways that we can make small improvements to how we're feeding children or what we're feeding children, I do want to be mindful that we're not overlooking kind of those fundamental issues. So that hierarchy at the base is access to enough food, because at the end of the day, we need to be secure that we have enough food in that moment.
Yeah.
Kind of that second level, once we have enough food, it's like, okay, is it enough foods that are acceptable to us? They may not be our favorite foods, but they're pleasing enough. And then we start to think longer term. So those are those most intimate, like in the moment needs that we have. Then we need this next level is, do we have access to foods over time that are pleasurable to us? And then we can start to talk about new or different foods. A lot of times we're jumping all the way up on the hierarchy, and we will talk about this in later episodes because that is part of exposing children to new foods and things like that. But wanting to be mindful that yes, we need some basic needs about having access to enough foods, and ideally ones that we like, to be comfortable and feel safe to then explore new or different foods, and then maybe select foods because of both the nutritional value that they offer us as well as the pleasurable factor. So kind of a quick random tangent, but just didn't want us to come across as like out of touch with understanding that what families are facing on any given day or week or month or year, it could look very different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So that was my random soapbox, I guess. So let's go back then. We talked about language. You gave examples of kind of these small changes. Let's talk about this idea of control. We talked about trust, but maybe if we look at the flip side of control, this idea of pressuring or restricting. So can you give an example of what it would look like for us to pressure a kid when they're eating or at the table?
Yeah. So let's set the scene. We're sitting at the table and child has broccoli left on their plate. They maybe haven't touched it at all. And you, as the caregiver or the adult in the situation, say, oh, you haven't eaten your broccoli, or before you get up, you need to finish blank. That would be, again, that external cue, that pressure put on for the child to eat.
Yes. And so there's such a fine line, and there's no single wrong,
Yeah.
or I shouldn't say there's no single right way to go about this, but that fine line between pressuring and encouraging. And so what I thought was really interesting in the Raising a Healthy, Happy Eater, they talked about whether it's okay, I'm using air quotes, okay to say you don't have to eat that.
Yeah.
Or kind of creating this guideline that in our family, we all take a bite. So there are different schools of thought here, and I want to acknowledge that. Sometimes people phrase it as a no thank you bite. Some people think that's really great because it gives that freedom and flexibility for the child to say, I tried it, no thank you. And then other people say, no, that's like setting children up to not want to eat the whatever is served. And so just finding out what works for a caregiver and a child, about how important it is to experience. I won't even say eat, because that's really far down the line of all the sensory experiences that are happening, but to experience,
just allowing that exposure to the food in a bunch of different ways. Like I really love how in the book they talk about how if a child reacts negatively to a food that is being served at dinner, I think they use asparagus as an example. But if a child reacts and is like, no, I don't want asparagus, just acknowledging it and saying, we're having asparagus tonight for dinner, or we're having asparagus, it's on your plate, and then changing the subject, moving on. So not necessarily reacting to the emotions that the child is having around the food, just kind of acknowledging it, like, this is what we're having tonight, moving on, and not saying anything about you're expected to eat it, or there's a certain amount that you have to finish, or that you even have to try it. But again, just exposing the child to the food being on the plate and moving on from that.
Such a helpful reminder, because yes, it can become emotionally charged, especially if we are all arriving at mealtime hangry or hungry, and it's been a long day and there are high emotions. I can think of a story recently where I was just putting food on a plate for exposure. I had zero expectations that it would be consumed. And the hanger emotions were really high, and the food was literally walked from the table back over to the kitchen and plopped in there. So and I just chose to ignore the behavior. So sometimes we can ignore rather than, as you said, engaging in the emotions that are happening. So instead of pressuring kids to eat, like, you have to try this, trying to remain calm. Sometimes just even a smile is helpful. I love to think about Green Eggs and Ham. Have you read that book before?
It's been a long time.
I probably don't have a reason to read it as much as I have, but we've read it a couple times over like the preschool years, and I'm like, oh, Sam is such a great role model for encouraging. He's always offering this grumpy guy, or I think the character's a guy, green eggs and ham. And Sam's always smiling, and it's just offering it in new ways or different ways. Like, could you on a boat? Could you with a goat? And then he replies, no, but over time, that repeated offering, the smile or pleasantries, although recently we were looking through and he's not smiling on every page. My oldest, then it was like a kind of a game. Well, he's not smiling there. But to say, like, that's a great example of how we can be subtly encouraging and not pressuring to introduce foods.
And that kind of goes back to the trust. The child will trust in the caregiver that they are providing foods, and then again, they can kind of tune into their own body and eventually decide when and if it is the right time to try it or taste it.
Yes, so pressuring is that great example of when we're stepping over that trust and trying to control. Restricting is another way that we as adult caregivers can overstep our roles. And so what would an example of restriction look like during a meal?
Well, like for example, last night with your little, when all she wanted was more and more applesauce, an example of restricting would be saying, no, you've had enough applesauce. Here is this instead. Or again, telling them whether they can have it.
Yes, great example to feedback. Felt like doing it and I almost did it, but then she just started eating other stuff on her plate. So sometimes waiting can be like no response can be helpful.
Yeah.
And a lot of times restriction might also, and pressure can go hand in hand. And we can think about like rewarding with foods or punishing with foods. Like, well, if you eat your vegetables, you can have dessert. Type of thing. And usually like it may seem to work in the short run, but in the long term, it tends to backfire. Children tend to like those foods you're wanting them to eat less, or kind of this dessert becomes put on a pedestal.
Or overstepping and eating past their hunger cues because they want something else, and then just like running over their hunger and fullness cues altogether.
Absolutely. So we've been talking about a few small things that we can do. Let's talk about a few other small ways that we can change the what, the when, or the where when it comes to establishing a nourishing eating environment. So what could we do instead of taking plates away without checking, or even filling them up if we see a plate's empty and just automatically filling them up?
So one of the options with filling the plates is having family style meals where you allow the child to serve themselves and decide how much of something they want. So instead of presenting a full plate to them and expecting them to eat it all, giving them a plate whenever they're old enough to serve themselves, and then allowing them to decide how much of each food they want to get. And then same thing at the end, not assuming that they're done with anything, but kind of like we touched on earlier, asking them if they are full or if they are still hungry, and then letting them decide.
Yes, and family style dining, I'm glad you brought it up. It was in both of these books that we're reading, and they had slightly different takes on it. So one was like a staunch advocate, like this is the way we feed our children, and the others were like, it's just an idea. And it may not work, right? Like the areas where you're eating might not have space for all. Like I think of Thanksgiving meals when I'm thinking of that, and it's just the spread everywhere. You can serve yourself. Yes. But an alternative to that might be having everything in the kitchen or wherever you prepare your food, and then walking through and kind of like if you were in a buffet style, holding it like, okay, we have that, like, so presenting what is there, and then there's that back and forth of choice and things like that. So, okay. So that's a great idea. Another thing is like children eating alone, kind of the where and the when. So what do you...
Kind of creating some structure around that, and like setting a time and place for meal and snack times so that they're really able to tune in to eating and not having distractions for that. So instead of having the child eat alone, even if you're just sitting at the table with them, maybe you are not hungry, you've checked in and you've decided you don't want anything, still sitting there and having a conversation with them and allowing them to enjoy the experience can have a big impact.
Okay. And then this idea of having really strict limits. Like, again, we're trying to do our best by creating a solid foundation of what we're serving or when or where, but life can be pretty unpredictable, predictably unpredictable, I should say. So how might we be able to approach that?
So what do you like a little more?
So if we have these hard and rigid, like if we're like, we don't eat after 7 o'clock in this house or something like that, what might be a more realistic way that we could navigate this what, when, and where, even when our schedules may not be under our control?
Well, I think it kind of just acknowledging the situation from the beginning, and then saying like, if it is dinner, if it's the last meal of the day, acknowledging like, this is when we are eating, this is what we are eating. The next time we're eating will be breakfast tomorrow morning. So then again, allowing them to kind of check in and decide, am I hungry? And then how much of this will I eat?
So all of these are very subtle things, but that's not to say they don't require a lot of effort or intentionality. Yes. And so giving ourselves grace and then just committing to these. But I think you're your ideas of really helping children distinguish, like, have you had enough
Mhm.
or are you still hungry? Tuning out the distractions so that children can focus on, that's like our job, still the where
Yeah.
and when,
Yeah.
that's that environment. And so that allows them to focus. So I think we've covered a lot
Yeah.
today. So maybe let's recap. So the roles of children and adults. We
Dividing it up, adults are responsible for providing the what. So what is being served for meal or snacks, and then the when and where meal or snacks are happening. And then the child, once presented with this format, they decide whether they're going to eat the foods there and how much of those foods they're going to eat.
Yes. And so this might take us a bit of reflection or observation, even just say, what are we doing currently? It may be different
Yeah.
than what we're doing. And so having some conversations and about what we're committing to,
Mhm.
the small changes to modify, to kind of have control where it makes sense within our role,
Yeah.
and then lean into trust
Yeah.
for one another,
Yeah.
that we can do that. And
Yeah.
then
And the trust kind of goes along with tuning in both with ourselves and checking in with the child to allow them to reflect on their hunger and fullness levels.
yeah, so if people are wanting resources, we'll have some links in our show
Mhm.
notes about scales that you can use
Mhm.
at the start or end of meals to check in with how hungry or full you or children are, as well as if people want to make changes, like kind of those small changes
Yeah.
they talked about. And people are always welcome to reach out to us at Snack Club, SNACK at uky.edu.
Yes.
Thanks for tuning in,
Yeah.
and we hope you'll join us again.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Snack Club. Resources related to the topics discussed in this episode can be found on our website, linked in the show notes. Your local cooperative extension office is also a wealth of information and can provide links to local resources.
If you have other topics you would like to hear about, send us a note at snackclub@uky.edu. That's snackclub@uky.edu. And as a reminder, the digestible bits of information we share are like navigation signs for your feeding journey, but you may need to contact a healthcare provider for more personal advice.
And last but not least, special thanks to our team behind the scenes, Mindy McCulley for bringing this audio and video file to life with her technology skills, and to the people through her marketing magic, and to Kelly Thompson for her creative ability to turn one conversation into our Snack Club symbol.
We hope to see you again soon.